The wine glass shattered against the wall 6 inches from my head, and a thin line of Merlot ran down the wallpaper like a wound. My granddaughter's mother stood at the end of my dining table with her arm still out, breathing hard, and she said, "You ungrateful old man, you'd rather rot in this house than help your own family." My son didn't look at me. He looked at his plate, and when I asked him, quietly, whether he was going to say anything, he finally lifted his eyes and told me, "Maybe it's time you stopped acting like our father." I dabbed the cold wine off my jaw with a napkin, smiled, and pulled out my phone. I texted my brother 3 words. "It's time, Walt." 45 minutes later, every single thing they thought they'd take from me was gone. But before I tell you the rest, do me a favor and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had family treat you like an ATM with a heartbeat. Hit that like button so I know I'm not the only one. Let me back up to the start of that afternoon, because you need to understand how ordinary it looked before it fell apart. It was the Saturday before Christmas, and I'd spent 2 days cooking. I'm 71 years old. I live alone in a 4-bedroom colonial outside Asheville, North Carolina. And I don't do much of anything anymore except tend the garden my late wife planted and keep the bird feeders full. But the holidays I still try. I made the ham the way Ruth used to, with the brown sugar glaze and the cloves. And I made her cornbread dressing from the recipe card she wrote out in 1979, the one with the grease stain in the corner that I will never wipe off as long as I live. I set the table with the good china. I even ironed a tablecloth, which is a thing I have done maybe 4 times in my life. My son came with his wife and their boy, my grandson, who is 6, and the only person on this earth who still thinks I hung the moon. His name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just call him the little one. He came running through the door ahead of everybody and hugged my leg and asked if I still had the train set in the basement. And I said, of course I did. And for about 90 seconds that afternoon, I was a happy man. Then the rest of them came in. My son had on a watch I knew good and well he couldn't afford on what he made, and his wife had a new handbag that probably cost more than my first truck. Behind them came her people, her mother and her father. I'd met them maybe 3 times in the 8 years my boy had been married, and every time I came away feeling like I'd been appraised by a pawnbroker. The father shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. The mother walked straight past the table I'd spent all morning setting and ran a finger along the mantel checking for dust. Then looked at the framed photos of Ruth like she was deciding which ones to take down. I didn't think much of it then. I just figured they were guests, and guests get a plate, and you smile through the rest. That's how I was raised. We sat down. I said a short grace because Ruth would have wanted it, and for a few minutes it was just the clinking of forks and the little one telling me about a dinosaur he liked. Then his mother set down her glass and said, in that bright voice people use right before they ruin your day, "So, we wanted to talk to you about something since we're all together." I should have known. The good cheer, the new clothes, the way her parents had brought 2 suitcases that were still sitting by my front door. I'd told myself they were staying at a hotel and traveling heavy. They weren't. "My parents," she said, "are between houses right now. The market's been brutal, you know how it is, and it just makes no sense for them to throw money at rent when you've got all this space sitting empty." She gestured around my dining room like she already had the deed. We were thinking they'd take the 2 rooms upstairs, just for a while, till things settle. I set my fork down. A while being how long? Her father laughed without any humor in it. "Does it matter? You're rattling around in here by yourself. 5, 6 rooms, 1 old man. Seems like a waste, you ask me." Nobody had asked him. I looked at my son. "Is this what you came here to do?" He shifted in his seat. "Dad, it's not a big ask. They're family. You always say family takes care of family." "I say a lot of things," I told him. "I never said I'd hand my house over to people I've met 3 times. That's when his wife's voice went flat and ugly. "It's not your house to be so precious about. It's a house. It's a thing. You're going to be gone in 10 years anyway. And then what? It sits empty. At least let it do some good while you're still breathing." I want you to sit with that for a second, because I sure did. My own daughter-in-law at my table eating my food, telling me to my face that the smart thing for me to do was die and get out of the way. I kept my voice even. The answer is no. They're welcome to dinner. They're not welcome to move in. And that's when she picked up the wine glass. I've thought a lot about that moment since. People in the comments on these kinds of stories always say, "Why didn't you just throw them out? Why didn't you stand up? You're a grown man." And I'll tell you exactly why. Because the second that glass left her hand and hit the wall behind me, I stopped being angry. I went somewhere cold and quiet, the same place I used to go when I ran my crews, and the job started going sideways and panicking would have gotten somebody killed. I spent 40 years as a general contractor. I have stood in buildings that were coming down around me. You learn that the man who keeps his head walks out, and the man who loses it doesn't. So I didn't throw them out. Throwing them out would have ended it that night, and they'd have come back next week, and the week after, wearing me down a little at a time until I gave in just to make it stop. I'd watched that exact thing happen to my neighbor down the road. His kids moved in temporarily, and 3 years later, he died in the back bedroom of his own house while they had the master. No, I wasn't going to win this with my hands. I was going to win it with paper. And I'd already started 2 weeks earlier. See, this wasn't the first warning shot. A month back, my son had called me, real casual, asking whether I'd ever set up a power of attorney in case anything happened, and whether he should be on my bank accounts to help manage things. I told him I'd think about it, then I'd hung up and called my brother Walt, who spent 30 years as a forensic accountant before he retired. The kind of man who can look at a bank statement and tell you somebody's whole life. And I'd said, "Walt, I think my boy's wife is circling something." And Walt had said, "Then let me have a look before you sign one single thing." So while everyone thought I was just a sad old widower puttering around with his tomatoes, my brother had been pulling threads. And what he found he'd sent me 3 days before that dinner in a folder I had not yet had the stomach to open all the way. But back to the table. The glass was on the floor. The wine was on the wall. My grandson had started to cry this small, confused sound, and his mother didn't even look at him. She just stared at me, waiting, like the violence was a normal part of negotiating. I picked up my napkin. I wiped my face, and I smiled at her, which I could see unnerved her more than anything else I could have done. "You're right," I said. "We're all family here, so let's keep it in the family." I took out my phone, and I texted Walt. "It's time." Then I stood up, set the napkin on my chair, and told them I needed to use the restroom and clean up the wine before it stained. My son's wife told me not to take all day, that they still needed to bring the suitcases up before it got dark. I walked down the hall to my study, and I shut the door and I locked it. Now my study doesn't look like much. It's where I keep my old blueprints and my fishing gear and a desk that's older than my marriage was. But 5 years ago, after a string of break-ins out our way, I put a real lock on that door. A deadbolt set into a reinforced frame, the kind I used to install on job site offices. And I'd put in cameras, not just outside, inside too, in the common rooms, because a man who lives alone likes to know what's happening in his own home. I never told my son. It never came up. I sat down at the desk and I woke up the laptop and I pulled up the camera feeds, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The second I was out of the room, they dropped the act. The father had gotten up and gone straight to the cabinet where I keep Ruth's mother's silver, and he was running his hands over it, lifting pieces, checking the stamps on the bottom like he was at an estate sale. The mother had drifted into the living room and was standing in front of the painting over the couch. A little oil landscape Ruth and I bought on our honeymoon in the Smokies. And she had her phone out taking pictures of it. My daughter-in-law was going through the drawers of my front hall console, flipping through my mail. And when she found something she didn't like, she balled it up and dropped it on my floor. And my son, my boy, he was just standing there in the middle of the dining room with his hands in his pockets, watching them rob me, doing nothing. That was almost worse than the rest of it. The only one behaving like a human being was the little one, sitting alone at the table, eating his roll, swinging his feet because they didn't reach the floor. My phone buzzed. Walt. He didn't waste words. You at the desk? Open the folder. All of it this time. I'm 20 minutes out and I'm not coming alone. So I opened it. I want to tell you that nothing in that folder surprised me, but that would be a lie. I knew my son was weak. I'd made him weak, if I'm honest, bailing him out his whole life, paying off the credit cards he ran up in college, covering the lease when his first business folded. I did it because I loved him, and because I'd promised Ruth, on the worst night of my life, that I'd always look after our boy. But I confused looking after him with never letting him fall, and you can't build a man who's never been allowed to stand on his own. I knew all that. What I didn't know was how bad it had gotten. The first page was my son's finances, and they were a graveyard. The business he'd told me was really turning a corner had been dissolved by the state of North Carolina 16 months ago. The address on his letterhead was a mailbox at a pack-and-ship store. He owed the IRS more than I made in 3 good years back in my prime. And there, on page 2, was the thing that made my hands go cold. He'd taken out a second mortgage on my house, using a power of attorney I had never signed, with a notary stamp from a woman Walt had already found, was facing charges in 2 counties for exactly this kind of thing. My signature was on it. It was a good forgery. It was not my hand, but it was close. My son had stolen my house out from under me on paper, and now his wife was here to take it in person. I kept reading. Her parents were the real professionals. They weren't between houses. They were running. There was a civil judgment against them in Florida for a scheme where they'd talked a bunch of retirees into investment seminars and walked off with the deposits. There was an open fraud investigation in Georgia. They moved every few months, always 1 county ahead of a process server, and they did it under little variations of their names. My house, way out at the end of a county road, an old man's house with no neighbors close and no questions asked, wasn't a place to stay for them. It was a place to hide. And the last thing in the folder was a string of text messages Walt had pulled between my daughter-in-law and her mother from 2 weeks back. I'll spare you most of it, but the part I can't forget, the part I'll take to my grave, was her mother asking whether the old man was going to be a problem, and my daughter-in-law writing back, "He's lonely, and he's slow, and once Mom and Dad are in, we just don't leave. Squatters have rights. By the time he sorts it out, we'll have what we need." What we need. Like I was a vending machine that had stopped giving chain. I closed the laptop. My hands had stopped shaking. That cold, quiet place had me all the way now. I heard them in the hall. My daughter-in-law's voice, sharp, calling my name. Then a fist on the study door. "What are you doing in there? We're trying to get settled. Open up." My son's voice behind hers, softer, embarrassed. "Dad, come on. Don't make this weird." I checked the camera at the front of the house. Down at the end of my long gravel drive, where the road comes off the highway, I saw headlights turning in. More than one set. A county sheriff's cruiser, then another, then a plain dark SUV, then a tow truck riding low and slow. Walt was as good as his word. He hadn't called the local boys for a noise complaint. He'd called people who knew exactly what Hank and his wife were wanted for, and they had been waiting a long time for somebody to give them an address. I stood up. I straightened my collar. I unlocked the study door and opened it, and there they all were, crowded in my hallway like they had a right to it. "There he is," her father said. "We were about to break the door down, old man." "That won't be necessary," I said. "Why don't we all go back to the table?" Something in my voice must have reached them, because for the first time that day, they looked uncertain. I walked past them, calm as a Sunday, and I went and stood at the head of my table, and I picked up my own wineglass, the one that hadn't been thrown, and I looked at the 4 of them. "You wanted to talk business," I said. "So let's talk. You've got about 3 minutes before this stops being a conversation you control." "What's that supposed to mean?" my daughter-in-law snapped. "It means I know about the second mortgage." I watched my son's face fall through the floor. "I know about the forged power of attorney. I know your friend the notary is already cooperating with 2 district attorneys." I turned to her parents, And I know about Florida and Georgia. And I know there are people who've been looking for the both of you for a long time. And I know exactly where they are right now." The father went gray. He set down the silver candlestick he'd been holding, which told me everything about why he'd really walked over there. "You're bluffing," her mother said, but her voice didn't have any floor under it. That's when the first blue light swept across my dining room wall. I have never in my life seen 4 people move so fast and so uselessly. The father went for the back door and found the deadbolt I'd thrown that morning out of pure habit. The mother grabbed her coat off my chair and knocked over a glass doing it. My daughter-in-law spun on my son and started screaming at him to do something, to fix it, that this was his fault, that his idiot father had ruined everything. And my son just stood there in the middle of it, looking at me. And for 1 second, he wasn't 36 and he wasn't a thief. He was a little boy who'd broken something and knew it. The deputies came up the porch steps and knocked, loud and official, and called my name, and I walked over and opened my own front door to them, polite as you please. I told them everyone they wanted was right inside. The man from the SUV had a folder of his own and a list of names, and when he read the father's name off it, the old grifter just sat down heavy in my dining chair, like all the air had gone out of him. They took the parents first, cuffs and everything, right there next to the cornbread dressing. The mother was crying and saying it was all a misunderstanding, that she was somebody's grandmother, and the deputy who walked her out had clearly heard it 100 times and said nothing at all. My son, they didn't cuff. Not yet. The man from the SUV explained, gentle enough, that there were questions about the mortgage and the power of attorney, and that it would go a lot easier on him if he came in and talked rather than waiting for a warrant. And my boy looked at me, and I saw him understand for the first time that I knew. That I'd known the whole time. But the slow, lonely old man had been 3 steps ahead of all of them. "Dad," he said, his voice broke. "Dad, I never wanted." "You signed my name," I said. "You put my house up to cover your debts, and you brought these people into my home to push me out of it. I had to stop for a second. I'd have given you anything. You only ever had to ask, but you didn't want to ask. You wanted to take." His wife was still going, even with the deputy's hand on her arm, calling me every name she had, telling me I'd regret this, that I'd die alone, that I'd never see my grandson again. And that last one would have cut me to the bone an hour earlier. But I'd read those text messages. I knew now what she'd planned, and what kind of woman threatens an old man with his own grandchild to get at his house. "You won't keep that boy from me," I said, and I didn't raise my voice because I didn't need to. "Walt already made a call. There's a family lawyer waiting on Monday, and given what you and your husband are about to be charged with, I don't think a judge is going to worry too much about my visitation." She didn't have anything to say to that. For the first time all day, that mouth of hers just closed. They let her out. I stood on my porch in the cold and watched the cruisers go back down my gravel drive, their lights painting the bare trees red and blue, and then turn onto the highway and shrink and disappear. And the sound of them faded until all I could hear was the wind and a dog barking somewhere a mile off. When I came back inside, the little one was still at the table. Somebody had thought to leave him, or nobody had thought of him at all, which is closer to the truth. He looked up at me with those big eyes and asked, in that small voice, "Grandpa, where did everybody go?" I sat down next to him. I cut him a piece of ham. "They had to leave, buddy," I said. "But you and me, we're going to finish dinner. That all right with you?" He nodded and went back to his role, like the whole world hadn't just ended, the way little kids do. And I was grateful for it. More grateful than I have words for. Walt came in the back door a minute later, stamping the cold off his boots, and he took one look at me and at the wine on the wall and the broken glass on the floor and the boy eating his dinner, and he didn't say anything wise or hard. He just put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed it and said, "You did right, brother." And then, because he's my brother and he knew I was about to come apart, he picked up a plate and said, "Now, is anybody going to carve this ham, or are we just looking at it?" We ate. The 3 of us at a table set for 10. The ham was cold. It was the best meal I'd had in years. That was 4 months ago now. My son took the deal and he's cooperating, and his lawyer thinks he'll do some time, but not a lot, because in the end he was a coward and not a mastermind, and the courts can tell the difference. His wife and her parents are facing a stack of charges in 3 states. I don't follow it too closely. It doesn't bring me any joy. What I did do was something my brother thought I'd lost my mind over. The house. The one they'd all been circling like buzzards. The one my son mortgaged behind my back. I cleared the lien on it, and then I put it in a trust. And the trust says it can never be sold and can never be borrowed against. And when I'm gone, it becomes a respite home for the grandparents in this county who are raising grandkids on their own, the ones the system forgot about. There's a lot more of us than you'd think. I named it after Ruth. I think she'd have liked that better than any inheritance. I kept enough to live on. I've got my Social Security and a pension and 40 years of doing right by people who paid me on time, and that's plenty for an old man and a bird feeder. I have custody hearings on the calendar and a fair shot at keeping my grandson in my life, which is the only thing out of all of it I actually prayed for. People ask me if I regret it, cutting my own son loose like that. And I tell them the truth, which is that I didn't cut him loose. He let go a long time ago, and I just finally stopped pretending my arm could reach that far. Here's what I've come to know, sitting alone in this big quiet house that's mine again, free and clear. Family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who'd never in 100 years pick up a glass and throw it at your face. And the most dangerous thing you can ever say to someone is yes, when every honest bone in your body is screaming no, just because you're scared of being alone. I almost said yes that day. I came so close. And it would have cost me everything, slow, in the dark, with no sirens and no one coming. So if there's somebody in your life wearing you down a piece at a time, telling you that your no is selfish and your boundary is cruel and the loving thing to do is hand over the keys, I want you to hear an old man who learned it the hard way. The loving thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing. And a quiet house you can call your own beats a full one where you're not safe in your own bed. If any part of that landed with you, do me the kindness of hitting that like button and subscribe if you want to sit with me a while longer. Because I've got more of these than I wish I did, and I'd rather tell them to you than to an empty room. For weeks after that night, I kept coming back to one simple truth that I'd somehow managed to ignore for 36 years of being a father. Nothing that happened at my table happened all at once. It was built, board by board, the way I used to frame a house. Every time I paid off my son's debt without asking him to look me in the eye, I drove a nail. Every time I told myself his silence was shyness and not cowardice, I set another beam. I built the very thing that turned on me, and a man my age ought to be honest enough to admit that. The Wineglass didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of years. That's the hard part of cause and effect. It doesn't care about your good intentions. Sloan threw that glass because somewhere along the line she'd learned that pushing me got results, and she learned it from watching my boy push me his whole life. Her parents came to hide in my house because they'd spent a lifetime choosing the easy lie over the honest day's work, and the easy lie always runs out of road eventually. None of it was an accident. It was a harvest, and every one of us had done some of the planting. But here's the other side of that same coin, and it's the part I want you to carry out of here with you. If a bad ending can be built one quiet choice at a time, then so can a good one. The reason I had a folder instead of a heart attack that night is that 2 weeks earlier I'd done the uncomfortable thing and called Walt. The reason I didn't sign my house away is that I'd sat with my own fear and refused to let it make my decisions for me. And the reason I can sleep now is that when the moment finally came, I held the line, even though holding it meant losing my only son. So if you take anything from an old contractor who learned all this too late, let it be 3 things. Tell the truth, even the small truth, even when a lie would keep the peace tonight, because the peace a lie buys you always comes due with interest. Use the good sense the years gave you, and that means looking at what people do instead of what they say, and being willing to see the rot in something you love before it brings the whole structure down. And when you finally know the right thing, find the backbone to do it. Even alone, even scared, even with your hands shaking and nobody clapping. I'm 71. I lost a son, and I kept my dignity. And I will tell you plainly that I'd make the same trade again, though it costs me something every morning when I wake up. My grandson comes by on Sundays now. I'm teaching him to be honest, to be smart about people, and to be brave when it counts. And I figure if I can pour those 3 things into that little boy, then maybe Ruth's house ends up meaning something after all.